So let's talk for a few minutes about unconscious bias and things like that. And also about this concept of advantage or privilege. And we've already touched on unconscious bias when we talked about the implicit association test and things like that. And also, I want to point out that you've probably heard of the term social privilege. And you hear, oh, there's white privilege, there's male privilege, there's this privilege, there's that privilege. And I don't like the term privilege because it implies a different connotation to people. When you say that you are privileged, we assume it's an entitled situation, that I brought it on myself, that I believe I deserve these things. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the advantage that society confers on you because they look at you and they assume that you are better or worse or whatever than another person because of that. That's the advantage point of it. So there are white advantages. We know white people are more likely to get a job. There has been decades of research on this that says people with what are stereotypical white names and stereotypical ethnic names, white names, more mainstream Western names, are much more likely to be hired than somebody who is called a unique name that is not traditional in the Western, Western frame of what naming should be. So privilege exists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But I want to talk about unconscious bias. Now, here's how unconscious bias works. It's a social stereotype. It's an assumption that we make, and we're not even aware that we're making the assumption. Well, let me give you an example of that. So I ask, you can see the questions there. What's the average height of men? And mostly when I do training sessions on this sort of stuff, most people will tell me, yeah, it's about 5'9", 5'10", and that's about right. Depending on who you talk to, it's about 5'9", 5'9.5", the average height for men. What's the average height for women? On average, women are usually about 5'3", 5'4", 5'5", depending, wherever. So let me ask you a question then, right? And if men and women are equally capable of doing a job, and men and women are, have certain average heights, explain to me why the majority of leaders, and particularly CEOs and presidents, like President of the United States thing, why are they over 6 foot tall? Why do we confer leadership on people who are tall? That is height privilege, and it's also an example of unconscious bias, right? We don't even know we're doing it, but when a tall person walks in the room, we all look up and we defer and we think, oh, wow, they are in control of this room. They're big, they're tall, they're strong. We make all these unconscious associations in our head that height means good leader, when in fact it's not. Now, does that mean that height didn't have some, prehistoric value to us, genetically speaking, way back in the day when we were running from saber-toothed tigers? 100%. The strongest leader had to be somebody who was tall and strong and able to fight back wildlife and keep their tribe safe. So there are certainly some genetic, predispositions to that behavior because of the fact that tall, primitive, if you will, tall people were more likely to be stronger and would protect others. But we're not being chased by saber-toothed tigers anymore, my friends. We are competing in a world where men and women are equally capable of doing a job, yet that bias towards tall still exists. And it's an unconscious association and an unconscious bias that's bred in our DNA, that is bred in our unconsciousness about how we perceive somebody that we see like that. So that is considered an unconscious bias and a height privilege. So unconscious bias comes from this idea that we don't even recognize when we're doing it, but we have an implied assumption about who people are simply because that's what we've been taught without even thinking about it. I know for myself, I grew up with certain messages taught to me that I internalized and didn't even think about. And it wasn't until I got older that I had to grapple with those and wonder, why do I believe that? Oh, that's because my dad said that thing to me when I was like 5 that stuck with me for, 50 odd years. And now I remember that thing, and I remember that's why I believe that thing. I was at a party one time, and I know I got taught my whole life, right? Education is so important. Go get a degree. The more advanced you are, the better off you are. Oh, yeah, you're getting a master's. Oh, yeah, you're a PhD. Isn't that amazing? That's the pinnacle. That's what you're supposed to do. Education, education, education. So I'm sitting down with some people at a party, and this person was talking about working in a vet clinic. And I said, oh, are you a vet or just a vet tech? And my friend nudged me and like, just a vet tech? And I went, oh, wow. Just a vet tech was judgmental and an unconscious bias. The assumption that being a vet tech was not that important relative to being a highly educated vet, right? And it's the same thing, right? We see with doctors when somebody comes in and they're saying, I don't feel good, and the doctor's like, well, I'm the doctor. I know everything. You don't know anything, and you just need to listen to me or don't. And that's how ego comes into play, and it's an unconscious bias because we assume the doctor must know everything, and the doctor assumes they know everything, right? So I was engaging in my own educational bias, unconscious bias, that the unconscious messages that I've gotten my whole life was more education is better, more education is more important, more education is good. And I don't consciously believe that, but that was the message I had sent to me for my whole life. And I know better now. And now that I'm aware of it, I'm much more mindful of how I speak. And when I talk about those sorts of things, but it's kind of embarrassing, right? To have that come out and recognize, wow, I never even occurred to me that was my unconscious bias towards, people who were, had a different education, right? So I've learned, right, to look at that and to own when I see the mistake and I need to fix the mistake when I have an unconscious bias pointed out to me, and being open to hearing that unconscious bias pointed out to me. But we all have them. If you don't think that you do, you aren't really paying attention. We all have it. Good people have it, not so good people have it, smart people have it, not so smart people have it. All across the spectrum, every human being, there's no category of human being that doesn't have an unconscious bias about something, whatever it is, because unconscious biases come from the lifetime of messages and experiences that we have that frame the way that we see the world to the point where we don't even think about why we do things. We just do them. Why we think about things the way we do. We just think that way. And that's what also reinforces us to say, no, there's one right way to do it. There's only this way to do it. That ethnocentric perspective that only my way matters. Only my way is right. So that unconscious bias then gets reinforced, and we don't even recognize that we're doing that. So it's hard for us to grapple with bias when it's so unconscious that we're not even aware of it. So the goal is, when it's pointed out to you, you know better. And when you know better, as Maya Angelou would say, you do better. And so doing better then is about recognizing where our unconscious bias is and working to overcome that. And that's why taking that implicit association test is really important. And you'll be doing an exercise on that for this class. You will be, doing implicit association and figuring out where your implicit association and biases are. You don't have to share that with anybody else. You're just sharing it with me for the purpose of the assignment, bringing awareness to you. And if we're bringing awareness to you, now the goal is, what can you do to overcome this unconscious bias? And that's the goal of the assignment, is helping you to develop a plan to think about the world in a different way through different eyes. I want to wrap with this notion of advantage or privilege. Again, you've heard about privileges. White privilege and white privilege, male privilege, you name it. Privilege is about the unconscious bias that people have towards others. And that can be a bias to the good or bias to the bad. But the unconscious assumptions that we make about people. So we know that tall people are more likely to become leaders. We know that good-looking people with symmetrical faces are more likely to get jobs. We know that people with ethnic sounding names are less likely to get jobs over people with more traditional Western sounding names. We know that a man and a woman with similar skills, same resume, and I've done a study on this, the same resume, when people are asked to assess the quality of that person and their ability to do the job, the man is considered more qualified. Hands down. I did a study on this. I asked people, how qualified do you think this individual is? Man's name on a resume, woman's name on a resume. Their resume was identical otherwise. And they were obvious, names, not like Jordan. And Jordan can be an ambiguous name, right? But it was a Alexander and a Constance, right? Those are two, no doubt about it, male name versus a female name. Those names were on the resume, and we asked people, men and women both, we asked them, how qualified is this individual to do this job? The man was considered significantly more qualified. But here's the cool thing in our study. What we did is we said, okay, we're going to give you some background information. You're going to learn more about this individual. And we gave them a ton of background information, and they said, here, you're going to go do we're simulating a reference check, and you did your reference check, and this is the information you got on this reference check. Now, tell me how qualified this individual is to do the job. And lo and behold, the man's qualifications stayed the same because nothing changed for them because they were still considered qualified. But the qualifications for the woman resume, even though the resumes were identical, the qualification of the women was increased. So it was now equivalent to the male. And they were considered equivalently qualified to do the job. What that tells us is when we're doing hiring, when we allow unconscious bias to enter into that screening process, we are far more likely to hire male candidates than female candidates. We are far more likely to dismiss the experiences of women simply from the basis of the name on the resume. So our goal always should be that we want to make sure we are including, right, and we're not looking at names on resumes, but looking at baseline characteristics. And if you covered the name on the resume and simply looked at the qualifications of the individual, we should be able to make an equivalent assessment and that they should be the same, right? And the same thing when it comes to the things that happen in symphony orchestras. In symphony orchestras, men dominated symphony orchestras, and women were always told they could not be as good musicians as men, which is not true. But nonetheless, that's what they were told until I think it was the 60s or the 70s when they started doing gender-blind auditions, where basically they would the person would audition behind a screen and there would be a rug on the floor so that people could walk across the floor on the rug and no one could hear their footsteps because high heels sound different than flats. So the person would walk across the floor on the carpet, they would perform, and then they would leave. And they were judged purely on their music, not on their gender or any impressions that anybody had. And lo and behold, the number of women and minorities in symphony orchestras increased tremendously. So now that there's much more gender and race parity in a lot of symphonic orchestras that never existed before, 30, 40 years ago. So there is privilege to being male. There is privilege to being white. There is privilege to being tall. There is privilege to being skinny. There are assumptions made about people based on the way that they present themselves. That's unconscious bias that biases us to the assumptions we make about someone's fitness to do a job. And we have to remember that privilege is not something that I asked for. Privilege is something that society gave me, whether I wanted it or not. That's what we're talking about. And I don't like using the term privilege, but I'm using it interchangeably here. I'm talking about advantage. I have an advantage because society says I have an advantage. And I didn't ask for that advantage, but that's what society says I have. And we have to own that, yes, there are advantages to being white, to being a man, to being tall, to being whatever is the category, right? So don't assume when someone says, you are privileged because you are male, or you're privileged because you're white, that you didn't have to work hard for what you did, because no one's saying that. You absolutely had to work hard. There's no doubt about it. But privilege is where you dismiss, you don't even recognize you're doing it when you dismiss someone else's story. When someone tells you a story about their experiences and you didn't experience it and you go, oh, that didn't happen. That's privilege, right? Or that's advantage, because I am advantaged because I never had to experience that. So again, I try very hard to stay away from the term privilege, because privilege has a different connotation for people, as if it was an entitlement. And I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that society decides who has advantage and who doesn't, not you. It's not you, but society decides it. And it's basically saying, all things being equal, with everything else is the same, the white person will get the job over the marginalized group. The man will get the job over the women. And I saw that. We see that in research study after research study. It happens, whether we like it or not. So be aware of this. Be aware of how we might unconsciously be biased when we're making hiring decisions, when we're entering information, when we're assessing our workers, when we're looking at them and we're deciding who gets the extra fun assignment to do, who needs extra help. Understand that we see these things with our unconscious biased lens when we're making these decisions. Be mindful of that. Bring it to the forefront, making sure you check yourself before you make a final decision. If it means that you need to sit down with someone else and say, like, I've got these two candidates. I'm not going to tell you the names. I want you to look at the two candidates and I want you to say, who do you like better? Who would you hire? If we remain blind and we only looked at their experiences and we only looked at, what projects they've worked on, who would you give the extra opportunity to? Well, that helps. Be mindful of where your bias is and then work hard to overcome it. How do we do that? We read, we write, we do podcasts, we go to seminars, we find ways to interact with people who are different than us to learn, to help to minimize those unconscious biases.